ไม่มีชะเบยกะไม่มีชะเบยกะไม่มีชะเบย I don't think that like my personal story has been shared, that often. I really wanted to take the opportunity to actually just open up to the audience and share a little bit about, my history and not just my own personal history, but also I think my ancestral kind of history as well. Those that have walked before me, how they've kind of impacted on my journey, not just with psychedelics, but really of healing. I was born in Singapore, and we're like a fourth kind of generation immigrants from both China and also Malaysia, which is my family. So we're kind of economic kind of immigrants that came into Singapore. And probably, as Singapore is a colonized, an extremely colonized country, I would say, because Singapore is a small island and it was colonized by the British India Company, who had at that time in England and the UK, it had the power as a business to colonize different countries that it would use for trade missions. So coming from a colonized country, heavily colonized, economically colonized, I think that really kind of affected just the conditioning of how I was kind of brought up, in a colonized kind of country. In addition to that, even though Singapore had its independence after World War II, I would say that even though, Singapore says that it's a socialist, like democratic country, the political kind of system in Singapore is one of a lot of oppression. So money is God, in Singapore, and there's no real connection to kind of nature. The whole city of Singapore is manicured, is manufactured for one purpose only, which is money. So as a kind of free-spirited, kind of wild, free thinker, which is very much my blueprint, I think, part of why I'm sharing the story is because trauma is also, I believe, political, and it's also very connected to our culture and our ancestry and also the environment of society. My personal kind of history, in addition to those political, systems, those cultural and societal systems, was that I was born into a family with a lot of violence, largely because my parents came from a Christian cult. So I was born into a Christian cult. And there are so many layers, I think, of oppression here that I just wanted to name. So the first one is the political oppression. So for example, in Singapore, there is no real freedom of speech. There are a lot of laws and regulations. And because it's a small, tiny island, there is a lot of oppression and not very much freedom in terms of being a free thinker and being someone that wants to be creative and, live out of the kind of normal society kind of conditioning. And then on top of that, I think my family, because I was born into a Christian cult, my father was a priest and my mother was a missionary. So there was also a lot of rules, in my upbringing. The world is very small, very black and white. It's either you're part of the Christian cult or you're not. And if you're not, then you're part of the devil. That is like the paradigm. And on top of that, I think the environment that I grew up in was a battlefield, in the sense that it wasn't very safe to be myself. And there was a lot of physical abuse. There was a lot of violence, emotional violence. I grew up in a household where I was, my mother especially was extremely kind of mentally unwell, and not really, I think, also because of her history and the ancestral kind of trauma that we went through. She was not equipped. She didn't really have the tools to become a mother, and that's really of no fault of her own. And another kind of piece that I might name here as well, about how important when we look at trauma to look at it in a holistic kind of perspective and to hold many different parts that have been touched, that have been through adversity, is that my mother's side is Chinese. So, they were fourth generation immigrants that came from China. But they were still very influenced, even though they were living in Singapore, in the conditioning of China, which is, and I would say this perhaps as a kind of overarching conditioning in Asia, that, women being born a female is not equivalent to being a man. So at that time when my mother was born, just at the tail end of World War II, so there was a lot of poverty, a lot of starvation. I come from a very working class family. And my grandmother, my mother was adopted, so my grandmother gave my mother away, largely because she was born female and she wasn't born, male. And it was very difficult, I think, because my mother was, in a way, given away to a foster family that was a distant relative. And the way that she was brought up was really to be a slave in that family. So because she wasn't mothered, I think, herself, and she was, went through adoption, there was a lot of kind of slavery and exploitation on her life. She wasn't really valued, as who she was. My mother really struggled, with her mental health and passed down that large imprint of trauma onto me when she was, mothering me. So I really identify with being a survivor of CPTSD because that was really my environment. And because there was so much violence, in my life, there was so much oppression politically, on a societal level, on a cultural kind of level. There was no autonomy, I suppose, when I was growing up. And amazingly, I was able to survive through the survival mechanism called dissociation, which was very helpful, I think, because if it wasn't for, I think, that mechanism, that biophysiological mechanism to split off from the pain, the suffering, especially at home, violence was happening on a daily basis. And, working with that kind of felt sense of danger from, birth, the only way I think that, and I'm speaking for perhaps listeners out there, if you're born into this kind of environment, the disassociation mechanism is one which is very effective. So I learned at a very young age to there were many parts of myself that were fragmented and kind of really numb. When I think about my life as a teenager, it was like I was inhabiting the space like a little bit like an arm's length away from my body. So I was kind of floating very much out there in the world, trying my hardest not to have violence inflicted onto me. But there was also a lot of, trauma happening as well in school because of what was happening at home. School was very difficult. School was, there was no safe place. There was a lot of bullying in school, largely also because I was very different. I was not a conventional girl growing up because I really had a very strong mind and just a sense of inner compass, because I think my autonomy was taken away from me. So there was an overcompensation of my own inner authority in a way. And one of the most, I think, pivotal moments for me in my life was when I was about 16 years old and I met a man who, by a chance encounter, we shared a very strong kind of connection that was quite visceral. The moment that I connected with him, and he invited me to go on a trip where he was trip sitting. This was probably not my first experience of LSD, but a proper ceremonial, I would say, a properly guided experience that lasted probably for a day. And this is probably one of the most important, I think, experiences of my life, because I think largely also, the dosage that I had, but also my sense of safety with him. He was quite an experienced, I would say, guide. And just the level of space that he gave me, the level of safety, there was enough kind of connection, but then also enough kind of space. I had a very powerful experience, one of the most powerful experiences I've had, where because of, the trauma that had happened to me as a child, I had a lot of protection. And I needed to have a lot of protection, to live in Singapore, to live in my home, to interact with my family, to be in school. So I had a lot of protection to keep my inner world safe. There was also a lot of fragmented parts of me, a lot of numbing, a lot of disassociation. And in this psychedelic experience, which was really powerful, I felt the power of a higher intelligence. You might call it God, you might call it spirit, whatever you call it. But it was like a lightning bolt that hit me through the crown of my head, down towards my midline. And it kind of broke or shattered all of the layers of protection around me in a, how to say, like in my inner psychic space. And within that kind of like huge shattering, like glass that, like you're in a glass cage and it just completely shatters, I could feel not just this higher intelligence of God or whatever you call it, spirit, enter my entire flood my entire body. But those parts that had been split off for me, all started to in a miraculous way, kind of piece themselves back inside. And there was nothing else to do but just sob, just sob and grieve. Because with the shattering, it was also all the pain, that I had held inside as a young person that I couldn't process. There was no way of processing. And during that time, mental health was very different from mental health right now. And they were partly tears of grief, but they were also tears of joy, because for the first time, I could really feel my essence. I could really feel my blueprint. I could feel, what Dr. Richard Schwartz, the founder of internal family systems, call, that self with a capital S. And in addition to that, I also felt the energy of this higher intelligence, be it God, be it, spirit. And it was very clear to me from that felt sense experience, from that subjective experience, that I was part of this higher intelligence. That was really when I had that felt sense of faith, like, wow, I know who I am. For a lifetime of the conditioning that was told to me, the messaging is that you're bad, you're a sinner. I was like, I'm good because I am part of life, I'm part of the high intelligence, which is good. And I can feel it so strongly in this felt sense. So I think that, I guess this is one of the life experiences that I wanted to share with you, with those that are listening, because it did embark me on a path that I feel like, I feel very passionate about supporting and helping how to actually, folks that are coming to the psychedelic field to heal. Really, that was kind of the pivotal moment that created this path of healing